Hello everyone, JD here. This presentation is entitled The Challenge of Social and Economic Change. It has 4 subtopics, the first of which is the abolition of slavery, secondly, American cultures, thirdly, development and underdevelopment, and lastly, altered environments. So, the abolition of slavery. Those who sought to end the institution were called abolitionists. And, abolitionism really takes off in the United States in the 1830s. I want to say this. Back in the 18 teens, someone came up with this idea of colonization movement and this idea of let's take former slaves and return them to the continent of Africa. But if you think about that for a second, people in many cases are going to be generations removed. So the idea of going back to Africa really isn't practical. Right? And I could see a lot of people not wanting to leave because their family had been here for so long and their generations removed. So that idea came to pass, and eventually we have anti-slavery advocates, and we have people who were gradualists, and eventually we have these immediatists. And these abolitionists are a very strong position on the issue. They are very strong, very passionate in many cases. And they want it ended immediately, meaning they want it to stop now. They don't want to wait for, as some of the gradualists had suggested, they do not want to wait for a slave owner or plantation owner to pass away and then free the slaves that the person owned in their will. They would rather people just look at this institution and agree with them and say, okay, this is undesirable for moral reasons and legal reasons and so forth. But I have to emphasize here, slavery is a system of labor that had been adopted in various places, right? And a lot of people thought of it as normal. When we look back in retrospect, we think, how is that ever possible? But it was normal. And when I say this, I'm in no way, shape, or form trying to justify it because I don't think it is defensible in any way, shape, or form. I want to be clear. So people who are listening to this, you understand that as a trained historian, we try to understand why it is people thought the way they did at a specific point in time. But when I say that, I'm in no way, shape, or form justifying it. The abolitionists are going to emphatically oppose. They want it eradicated. But remember, abolitionists are going to comprise only a fraction, a very sliver of the population. Most people did not agree with that abolitionist perspective. And this is into the couple points I want to make here. Despite their efforts, slavery survived in most of the hemisphere until the 1850s. And part of the reason for that is that this institution is normative. It's common practice. And there are people who are living in places like the southern United States who might not have owned slaves, and you have to understand this. Most people in the southern part of the United States did not own slaves, right? But they still accepted the fact that this system of labor existed. Doesn't justify it, but they accepted it. All right, especially difficult to eradicate in regions where the export of plantation products like cotton and sugar was most important. So this is in the United States because we grow a lot of cotton here from places like Georgia on over to eastern Texas. We've also got Brazil and Cuba, places where sugar is going to be grown. And I bring this up because these are real cash crops. People are making a lot of money. And that is no justification for it. But when it is an accepted practice in terms of the labor, the form of labor, and people are making a lot of money, in their mind, they're thinking, well, why would I abandon this? Okay. Slavery in the United States was weakened by abolition in some northern states and by the end of the African slave trade in 1808. So we stopped importing them into the United States in 1808. The profitable expansion of cotton agriculture after War of 1812 stalled progress. So while it seemed like for a bit there, for a short period of time, that we might be moving away from this system of labor, cotton agriculture is really going to take off. And remember, cotton is important for the manufacturing textiles. All right, so Spanish America. Tens of thousands gained freedom by joining the revolutionary armies that fought for independence. After independence, republics prohibited the slave trade, and growing international demand for sugar and coffee slowed the achievement. Brazil and Cuba increased imports of slaves even as their neighbors began gradual abolition. Right? American abolitionists argued that slavery offended Christian morality and universal rights asserted under the Declaration of Independence. So you think about that. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The Declaration of Independence is one of the most important, you could argue it's one of the most important documents in U.S. history. And it certainly is right there at the top of the list when we talk about our nation's inception. All right. But when you talk about principles, you talk about life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. At no point did slavery ever square with the principles that we find so important in the United States that transcend time, right? And it never fit in. We have a democratic republic. Owning and controlling people, relegating them to the status of property, never squared with our bedrock principles, okay? It's important to say that. Women and free African Americans played important roles in this abolitionist movement. Women were among the leaders of the American Anti-Slavery Society and produced effective propaganda against slavery, and eventually thousands of them joined the cause. It's like a political avenue or an avenue of political expression, right? People have this opportunity, women have this opportunity to join in this cause. And from that, we're also going to see people taking more of an interest in women's rights. Now, this is the time period we're talking about is like 1830s, 1840s. It's not that women's rights or that people hadn't been talking about slavery until then. Yes, people have been talking about it in years prior, but it really gains momentum. And of course, just as a side note, we have the first women's rights convention in Seneca Falls, New York. This is 1848. And people like Elizabeth Cady Stanton had been involved in the abolitionist movement. Right. Social conservatives and defenders of slavery attacked their highly visible public role, that is women we're talking about here, and African Americans, leading many to become advocates of female suffrage. And there were African Americans who supported female suffrage. There were a variety of people who did. But the defenders of slavery are going to push back because you're challenging their way of life. And in the United States in particular, it's part of the Southern social order. That even if you were a yeoman farmer who didn't own any slaves, you still accepted the social order. So there are going to be folks who push back. In 1850, the electoral strength of the newly formed Republican Party forced a confrontation between the slave and free states. And that's what they were trying to do in the years prior. They're trying to maintain this balance. If you admit one as a slave state, there's got to be a free state. Or a free state, you have to admit one as a slave state. But that was never going to last because it's very difficult to maintain it. And then following the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860, 11 southern states seceded from the Union, which means they left the United States. They declared themselves separate. All right. And this is in part a reaction. There were people really upset with Abraham Lincoln. And it's important to mention here, Abraham Lincoln was very much a politician. Preserving the Union was a major priority. I don't like to think of Lincoln as like a devout abolitionist because he was more of a politician than anything if you read a bit about him in terms of how he approached his work, right? So during the Civil War, pressure for emancipation rose as tens of thousands of black freemen and escaped slaves joined the Union Army. Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. A 13th Amendment to the Constitution abolished slavery completely. So the Emancipation Proclamation is 1863. And I'm going to put a link to it in the description section below the video with other resources. You can go and read it if you're interested. The 13th Amendment to the Constitution abolished slavery completely. And it's not just the 13th that's important. I mean, the 13th happens right there in the 1865. But we also, the 14th Amendment, which granted rights to people as citizens, and the 15th Amendment, which will grant people the right to vote, specifically men, regardless of whether or not you had previously been a slave or in any form of servitude. Okay. Most African Americans continued to live in harsh conditions. Southern states instituted Jim Crow laws that segregated blacks in public transportation, jobs, and schools, and this will coincide with increased racial violence. So you have the end of slavery, but then we have the beginning of Jim Crow. And this is going to go on for decades, a better part of 100 years, okay, in the United States. Brazilian slavery survived for more than 2 decades after the abolition in the U.S. Britain was a trading partner or trade partner to Brazil, pressed for an end to the slave trade after prohibiting this to its own colonies in 1807. So the British were ahead of the curve on this, and even obviously ahead of the United States. The British Navy, forced compliance in the 1850s. Brazilian Emperor Pedro II and many liberals worked to abolish slavery, but effort to find a form of gradual emancipation failed. During the war with Paraguay, large numbers of slaves joined the Brazilian army in exchange for freedom, and through this are able to demonstrate their patriotism and their heroism, which is going to convince a lot of people that slavery is unjust. Okay? Educated Brazilians had come to view slavery as an obstacle to the nation's economic development and as an impediment to democratic reform. Yeah, I mean, people who are have a better grasp of like governing institutions are going to look at this and say, well, how does this really square? How does this fit in with the other institutions that we have? Because slavery is an institution, remember. So how does it square with the other institutions? So this more educated class of people are going to they're going to question it, rethink it, and then definitely be supportive of abandoning it. As political support for slavery weakened in the 1880s, growing numbers of slaves fled their masters, and army officers resisted demands to capture and return runaways. So as support for slavery erodes, you're going to see people who are like, you know what, I don't want to participate in this. Right? And finally, it's abolished in Brazil in 1888. A year later, political rebellion ended the monarchy. So we officially in the United States end it in, well, it depends on when you date it to, but I would say with the amendments 1865. Brazil in 1888. All right. Caribbean received almost 40% of all African slaves shipped to the New World. All right. Tiny white minorities lived surrounded by slave and free colored majorities, and colored is a term that was used historically. Today we say people of color. That's the contemporary terminology that we use. All right. 18th century slave rebellion in Saint-Domingue spread terror among slave owners across the Caribbean, convincing slave owners that any effort to overthrow colonial rule would unleash new insurrections, and therefore there's little support for abolition. There's a lot of fear. Okay. Slaves helped to force abolition by rebelling in places like Jamaica and Cuba. Right? They also would run away, and there are other subtle ways because there are people who just simply didn't want to accept their condition, and I can understand that. I mean, in the United States, I've read about people leaving tools out to rust or setting fire to structures. I mean, there are a wide variety of ways in which people can resist the condition they experienced, because slavery is very much a condition. After 1800, profitability of sugar plantations in the British West Indian colonies declined. A coalition of British labor unions, Protestant ministers, free traders pushed for the abolition of slavery. Okay, Britain negotiated treaties with Spain, Brazil, and other importers of slaves to eliminate the trade and use its naval forces to enforce compliance. So we're going to see abolition in the British colonies, 1834. France, a decade later in the 1840s, and then the Dutch Empire, 1863. And the examples we have there are Suriname and the Dutch Antilles. Okay, lasted longest in Spain's colonies in Cuba, which will finally be abandoned in 1886, and Puerto Rico in 1873. Okay, I probably should have gone in the other order, chronological order. Puerto Rico is 1873, and Cuba is 1886. Okay, so we're going to move on to the second subtopic, American cultures. Despite discrimination, immigrants continued to stream into the Western Hemisphere. They introduced new languages, living arrangements, technologies, and customs because they're going to bring their way of life with them. That makes sense. People don't just abandon it altogether. And if you're listening to this presentation, you probably can think of contemporary examples of this. Altered politics in many nations as they sought to influence governing or government policies, and gain access to power. Because people want to have control over what's going on around them. They want to shape the laws that are enacted. So the only way you can do that is by participating in the political system. All right, to compensate for their isolation from home and culture, groups created mutual aid societies, sports and leisure clubs, and they had ethnic neighborhoods. And so that's where you can provide support for people who are like you. And we typically would gravitate towards people who are like us, right? And you think about it, if you've newly arrived in a country, you're naturally going to try to look for people that you're similar to because they speak the same language and they have similar experiences and cultural norms. So it's like you look for people who are similar to yourself. That would make sense. And this is where the mutual aid societies are going to be really helpful in getting people acclimated to their surroundings. They provided valuable social and economic support for recent arrivals. All right, shared experiences in their adopted nations as workers, neighbors, or soldiers change immigrants individually and collectively. The modification of language, customs, values, and behaviors through this process of acculturation. Okay, I want to say this. When any two cultures come together, neither of the two of them will ever be the same because they have an influence on one another regardless of how people respond to encountering another group of people, right? Because you bring whoever you are, you bring your culture with you, and that's your norms, right? Certain kinds of behaviors, traditions. You bring that with you. You speak a certain language, you eat a certain food, you wear a certain type of clothing, you listen to a certain type of music, and so forth. You bring that with you, and other people have theirs. So when the two of you encounter one another, one's going to bleed into the other, even if it's just to the smallest amount. Even if it's not extensive, it's still going to have an impact because the groups of people now know about one another, and in some way, shape, or form, they're going to influence one another. Okay, it's important to mention here. Made their mark on cultures of their adopted nations. They learned the language spoken as fast as possible to improve earning capacity. So there's an economic reason there. Dietary practices from Europe and Asia altered the cuisine of nearly every American nation. So there's the food part. Then there's the music part. Argentine tango transformed by new instrumentation and orchestral arrangements brought by Italian immigrants. So the Italians are going to have an influence in Argentina. And then Mexican ballads blended with English folk music in the U.S. Southwest. All right. Union movement and electoral politics in the hemisphere felt the influence of new arrivals. And that would make sense because if you're going to be working somewhere, like in a factory, and there's a union that's been organized, well then guess what? The union's going to have to be mindful of the fact that we have members who are from different places. In electoral politics, people eventually, as they go through the process to become citizens, they're going to some of them will want to cast a vote. Now, a lot of people don't vote in elections, but some people will want to vote, and that's helping choose the personnel of government, okay? So it's important to mention that here. We have anarchists and socialists from Europe who are going to come to the United States. They're going to influence the labor movement, and also they're going to go to Mexico and Argentina. We have benevolent societies and ethnic associations, pooled resources to open businesses, aid immigration of relatives, and bury family members. Yeah, I mean, we think about that. There are people who will travel to another country and want to become citizens, and then they're going to want to see their other family members come later. So they're going to have people, it's almost like a network to help people bring over family members. That's going to be happening, right? And, if you look at some of the data, I mean, the United States benefits greatly from having people come from different places. Benefited then and benefits in contemporary times. Okay, so let's move on to the third subtopic, development and underdevelopment. The effects of the Industrial Revolution, worldwide population growth, and increasingly integrated world market combined to stimulate economic expansion. Yes, that would make sense. When you talk about the Industrial Revolution, you talk about factories, you talk about people moving from the hinterlands into cities, you talk about people immigrating from one country to the next, and we talk about populations rising. Right? The United States, the only country to industrialize, but nearly every government in the hemisphere promoted new industries and technologies. It's going to be to their benefit. All right. Governments invested in roads, railroads, canals, and telegraph to serve distant markets while adopting tariff and monetary policies to foster economic diversification and growth. There's 2 points I want to make here. The US, Canada, and Argentina achieved income levels similar to that of Western Europe in terms of the success, what they're able to, the way they'll be able to participate in the Industrial Revolution and also benefit from it, right? And all three had open land, temperate climates, diverse resources, and immigrants, because that's going to be important and contributing variables, I think, to the success of the industrialization that will occur. Now, we say this when we talk about roads, railroads, canals, and telegraph. Let's look at this. Roads, railroads, and canals are all to transport goods. I mean, their economics is really the bedrock of that, the foundation. Because if you want to have a market, you've got to be able to get goods from point A to point B, right? And the roads, railroads, and canals are really important. This is going to be developing in the United States in the mid 19th century. And then the telegraph is how you communicate information from one place to the next. And so that plays an important role when you're communicating information, so that people can talk about different matters. That's going to definitely be a major contributing factor to the development of, markets and trade. Well, markets in particular, specific markets in particular, and trade in general. Because ideas have to flow from one place to the next. Okay, so, but what also is going to help, remember, the United States, Canada, Argentina is going to be the land, the climate, the resources, and immigrants. So there's a lot that has to be there in order for you to be successful, right? New demands for copper, zinc, and lead, coal, and tin unleashed by the Industrial Revolution led to mining booms in the western U.S., in Mexico, Bolivia, and Chile. Right? Mining companies were heavily capitalized international corporations that bullied governments and bought political favors. When you think of it this way, when you are a very strong company, you are going to have connections in government, and you're going to want to influence people to get what you want. You want policies that are enacted that are going to help you advance your interests, which means in this case making money. So these companies are going to become quite strong. These industries are going to be strong in general, but companies within the industry will also be strong, right? That needs to be mentioned here. European and North American corporations own nearly all the largest mining enterprises in Latin America. Well, if people in other countries, or in this case even continents, are going to control the business that goes on in places like Latin America, well then of course those companies in those countries are going to be advancing their own interests, in some cases to the detriment of people in Latin America. And that might partially explain why there's development in one place and more development in one place and less development in another. Especially if you're treated as largely a site where people are going to extract natural resources to make money, right? New technology accelerated economic integration, but the high cost of this technology often increased dependence on foreign capital. 2 points here to make. Governments promoted railroads by granting tax benefits, free land, monopoly rights to both domestic and foreign investors. And let's be honest here, you need the land. If you're going to lay railroad tracks, you've got to have the land to do it. That is so important. And then secondly here, vast areas of the Great Plains in the U.S., the Canadian Prairie, and Argentine Pampas, and parts of northern Mexico were producing grain and livestock for foreign markets. And you need to be able to get that from point A to point B. And this is going to be important here when I talk about this next item. In Argentina, the railroad, the telegraph, barbed wire, and refrigeration were introduced in the 1870s and 1880s. The distance of the European markets, they had previously prevented Argentine cattle raisers from exporting fresh meat. But they were able to overcome these obstacles. I mean, think about what refrigeration was able to do for people. In other words, the food wouldn't spoil. You can transport it from point A to point B more easily, a greater distance. And of course, the telegraph is for the communication. Barbed wire is also to protect, your livestock. That's important. And then the railroad to get it from point A to point B. So this is so important. I mean, it's so important for all of this to come together to make it possible so you can overcome the obstacles. All right, distinct economic tracks became visible. Industrialization and prosperity is going to exist in the English-speaking North American, or in English-speaking North America. So that would be, we're talking specifically the United States and Canada, okay, countries. Development, that's where you're going to see the development occur. And then with large merchant fleet, diversified economy that included manufacturing, adequate banking, and insurance services. So the U.S. is going to benefit from the expansion. It's going to occur with all of this, right? So this is where you see the development. Now, where do you see underdevelopment? Continued dependence on exporting raw materials and low-wage industries. This is going to be in Latin America. Latin American nations gained independence in the 1820s when the global economy severely contracted. And this is going to be different than the United States, because when the United States had its revolution, there was an expansion. But when Mexico has its revolution, there's actually, excuse my voice, there's a contraction going on. So when there's economic contraction, that's not to your benefit. Right. Spain and Portugal had promoted the production of agriculture and mining exports. After independence, faced competition and falling prices. Economies were subject to problems of oversupply and low prices, which leads to this boom-bust cycle. So when you're in a boom part of the cycle, you're doing very well. When you're in the bust, you're doing poorly. Sought to promote exports by resisting union activity and demands for higher wages and operating domestic markets to foreign manufacturers. Okay, resulted in low wages and the abundance of foreign goods undermine their efforts. And this is what's all happening in Latin America. So weak governments, political instability, and in some cases civil war slowed economic development. It's true, you think about that. If you have people in office who don't, I mean, there's two major problems you can run into with people in office: corruption and incompetence. That can totally undercut potential. It goes a long way to undercutting the ability to take advantage of the opportunities that you're afforded, okay? In any country, anywhere, that can happen. So corruption and incompetence. Any instability, if there's any fighting between political factions, because when there's fighting going on, you're not thinking about having to develop, or what you can do to develop and advance your interests. And or political instability, which means you don't know what's going to be happening with the system, and then the war. And really, the war contributes to political instability, so it's combining the two there, right? Infighting of any kind. So, because of this issue, or these issues, these people depended on importing foreign capital and technology, and Great Britain and the United States, they impose unfavorable trade conditions or intervene militarily to protect investments. So we have Great Britain and the United States taking advantage of the situation to advance their own interests at the expense of others. And countries have been known to do that. The United States is one of them. Has definitely taken advantage of situations that, can leave some people feeling uneasy. All right, Mexico, Chile, and Argentina failed to achieve high levels of domestic investment in manufacturing. All right, so we want to move on to the fourth subtopic here, and that is altered environments. Population growth, economic expansion, new technologies, and the introduction of foreign plants and animals dramatically change American environments. All right. Cuba's planters cut down the island's forest to expand sugar production. Well, there are detrimental effects to just taking out all of the forest by cutting down the trees. Okay. Demand for meat led ranchers to expand livestock raising in Argentina, Uruguay, southern Brazil, and the southwestern United States. Farmers in South Carolina and Georgia, which is here in the United States, of course, gained a short-term increase in cotton production by abandoning crop rotation, which is going to lead to soil exhaustion and erosion, because certain crops are very hard on the soil, meaning they really suck up the nutrients. Coffee planters in Brazil exhausted soil with destructive cycle of overplanting, followed by expansion onto forest reserves cleared by cutting and burning. So in Brazil, they're doing this too. They're cutting down forests, they're growing certain crops, and it has a detrimental effect on the soil. And also, I didn't know this either until I read about it. The use of the steel plows on North American prairies and Argentine pampas eliminated many native grasses. And when you eliminate the grass, that leads to erosion, which is very destructive. Okay. I also want to talk a bit about rapid urbanization. I was going to say it in reverse, sorry. Rapid urbanization. New York, Chicago, Rio de Janeiro, Buenos Aires, Mexico City were among the world's fastest growing cities. Government strain to provide sewers, clean water, and garbage disposal. Sanitation is really important when you have urban growth. When you have more people living in a concentrated area, you're going to have problems with sewage. You're going to have problems with water. You're going to have problems with, refuse. Like, what do you do with it? Where does it go? And if you notice this, if you ever go to any major cities today, regardless of where you're going in the world, major cities have problems that smaller cities don't. And we do much better in contemporary times than we did historically. But you think about this, you've got this factories that are being built, and then more people are moving into work in those factories, and then the cities are growing in size, and we have immigrants moving from other countries, and more people, there's this influx of people, and so when that occurs, you're going to have to find ways to deal with those growing pains, so to speak. I've sometimes heard people use the term growing pains, and I think that really applies here. And so you have to have ways to get people clean water, for example. Timber companies clear-cut areas of Michigan, Wisconsin, and the Appalachian Mountains to provide lumber for railroad ties and housing, pulp for paper, and fuel for locomotives and foundries. Okay. Forest industries of British Honduras, which is now Belize, Nicaragua, and Guatemala grew rapidly in response to the demand in Europe and North America for tropical hardwoods like mahogany. All right. Now we're going to talk about mining. And we should be getting a local history tingle here. Mining in Nevada, Montana, and California accelerated erosion and pollution. If you've never been to Virginia City, I encourage you to go over there. I've actually gotten a tour, it was about a year and a half ago. I went and did one of the hikes with the Nevada State Parks. We went up to the Donovan Mill, and we actually got a tour of the facility. And I can tell you this, mining the actual, pulling these minerals out of the ground, the process by which you do that, it scars the earth, right? And then when you process this and you're trying to separate the minerals from the soil itself or from the rocks, you actually have to use chemicals like arsenic and mercury in the process. And in Nevada, there's been a lot of mining for gold, silver, and copper. I just want to bring that up. So you've never been to Virginia City, you ought to take a ride over there. Not that far. I live in Carson City, so it's pretty close to me. But mining is going to take place there. And of course, we got to talk about other countries too. Brazil experienced a series of booms that began with gold and continued with iron ore, which led to, we had red soil ripped open, forest depleted, and erosion, it was uncontrolled. So there are going to be byproducts, negative byproducts, or what we might call a negative externality to an actual mining operation. It does do damage in multiple ways. Even when you're driving towards Dayton out of Virginia City, there are signs that say, that warn you about the creek that goes by, because it's like a creek coming out of an old mining town down towards Dayton. And yeah, that's makes you wonder, like, what's in the soil. All right, I want to say this too. We're going to end on a positive note. There were some efforts made at conservation, and I'm sure many of you have heard the name John Muir, and you're familiar with Theodore Roosevelt, one of the presidents here in the United States. These folks are big advocates for protecting certain land in order to preserve it so that we have it going forward, for future generations. Yellowstone in Wyoming became the first national park. That's in 1872. So actually this happens prior to Theodore Roosevelt becoming president, but he certainly worked on the issues while president. And John Muir is also going to be someone who's very important in contributing to that. Certainly in California, when you think about the John Muir Trail, think about Yosemite National Park and all the people who have appreciated it historically. That's part of the reason why it is a national park and has that iconic valley. I'll throw that in the mix here, but that's just a side note. I also want to say in Canada, because we don't want to leave out the Canadians here, they created the first national park in Banff. That's in 1885. So Yellowstone, which is in Wyoming, in 1872, and then Banff in Canada in 1885. This is where we're going to end. I want to thank you so much for sticking with me, listening to this presentation. And if you look in the description section below, you're going to find some other resources if you want to read more about some of the topics that were discussed here over the last, well, almost 35 minutes. So thank you so much for listening. Peace.